I'm really delighted to welcome to the podcast Professor Gad Saad. He's an evolutionary psychologist. He's at Concordia University in Montreal, but he's taught at Cornell, at Dartmouth, other places. He's also a public intellectual. He is the author of a fascinating book that I've been reading, The Parasitic Mind. You can see my markings all the way through the book. And he also does a podcast, which is called The Saad Truth. I like the pun in there, Professor Saad. I should tell my audience that they should check out your podcast. They'll be glad they did. So welcome to the podcast. Nice to have you. I've been looking forward to this.
Likewise.
And your book is subtitled How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. And it is a full-throated attack on a lot of, woke orthodoxies. But you don't just, you, as someone who's ensconced in academia, you say that this is posing maybe even an existential threat to the freedom of the mind, the idea of open inquiry, of scientific investigation. Say a word about the gravity of the situation, because some people may go, well, this is all crazy stuff. People are kind of fighting about a bunch of silly pronouns, but it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I often get this kind of rebuttal from folks where they say, well, you're taking the most extreme of woke examples that are restricted to some esoteric department in the humanities. Surely this doesn't apply to greater society. And of course, as we know, viruses eventually spread from outside the lab. They escape. By the same token, what I call idea pathogens or parasitic ideas may start in academia, but eventually they make it downstream. Our Prime Minister of Canada is a walking manifestation of every parasitic idea that I discuss in the book. So it is silly to trivialize the importance of these dreadful ideas. Eventually they attack our edifices of reason, our commitment to science, our commitment to common sense. And so they're anything but trivial, and we should eradicate these bad ideas ASAP.
We'll come back to how we should fight them, but let's diagnose the problem. Let's identify these viruses. Are they the viruses that appear in the familiar domains of race and gender and sexual orientation? Are those the viruses that you focus on?
Some of the idea pathogens deal with that. So I discuss things like biophobia, which is the fear of using biology to explain human behavior. So it's perfectly acceptable for many people that we use evolution to explain the behavior of every single species other than one species called humans. Or it's okay to explain everything about humans as long as it stops at the neck. But don't you dare, Dr. Saad, apply evolution or biology to explain why our brains do the things that they do. So certainly a lot of the gender and race and transgender activism relates to this kind of idea pathogen. But I would argue that the biggest idea pathogen of all, the granddaddy of them, although I discuss many of them in the book, is postmodernism, because it gets at the epistemology of truth, right? In science, we believe that there are certain natural regularities that we can explore. Science has provisional truths. What I thought was true 300 years ago may no longer be true, but there is a truth to be discovered. Postmodernism completely eradicates this possibility because it says that we are completely shackled by subjectivity, by our personal biases. There is no objective truth. So you can imagine how much of a form of intellectual terrorism to espouse this kind of nonsense to students.
What I find fascinating about the postmodern debate is when I first encountered it, this was in the 80s and 90s. I was a student at Dartmouth in the 80s. I began to write about this in the 90s. It was initially confined to the moral and social domain. So the idea was that there's a distinction between facts and values, and that facts have a certain kind of objective reality, but values are subjective. What I find really astonishing is that we have moved from the relativism of values to now the relativism of facts. If you are tracing this, when did that shift occur in which even facts are now held to be, in a sense, subjective?
So just to contextualize the timeline, postmodernism is something that has existed for about 40, 50 years, although the Frankfurt School could even go back earlier than that. But the ones that I typically focus on are the French postmodernists like Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. So they were some of the originators of this nonsense. I would probably say the early 90s, so probably just after you finished at Dartmouth. By the way, I was a professor at Dartmouth for a bit, is when we started seeing the complete eradication of logic, common sense, and reason. And I think the reason for it is that it is liberating, right? It is nice for me to be able to talk about my truth and not be shackled to anything called reality. It's liberating in some silly way. And so I argue that each of these idea pathogens start off with some noble cause because they free us from the shackles of reality. But when taken to an extreme, it becomes complete gibberish.
Now, you say it's liberating to be freed from the shackles of reality. Let's talk about that for a second. What is the appeal of being liberated from reality? Is it that reality imposes physical constraints? We are mortal human beings. We live, we die. Is it that reality says that there are certain givens of nature, that this is the way the world is, take it or leave it, but this is the deck of cards you've been dealt with. Play them as well as you can. Is there a certain human desire to move into a realm of fantasy where we leave all this reality behind, and why?
Yeah, great question. So depending on the idea pathogen, that which I'm trying to free myself of will vary. So take, for example, social constructivism, which is one of the idea pathogens that I discuss in the book. Social constructivism basically argues that we don't have any biological imperatives. We are born tabula rasa, and it's only our unique circumstances that cause us to be who we eventually become. Now, in some small way, of course, socialization and the environment matters, but certainly our biology also matters. But it is certainly a lot more freeing and hopeful to believe that my son could be the next Michael Jordan if only I were to hug him enough or not hug him enough or give him enough Big Macs or not give him enough Big Mac. Any of us could be the next Michael Jordan if we were given the right environmental trajectory. It's hopeful, it's freeing, it liberates me of my biological constraints, but it's rooted in complete BS. So in that sense, it's hopeful but nonsensical.
When we come back, I want to probe with Professor Saad. I want to burrow into some of the specific orthodoxies of race and gender and show why they contradict both science and reality.